Yeah, so I guess it was in 1997 that I first started planting a lot of rose bushes on campus here at UK in Lexington, and had a pretty large collection of rose bushes at the Arboretum for a while. Uh, at the peak, I probably had close to 2,000 different varieties, but uh, every year we would lose some roses to disease or winter kill, um, or virus. There were a couple of viruses that were pretty devastating. So I've killed more roses than most people will have the opportunity to kill, and learning how to grow roses successfully. They're like other plants that they have some basic requirements. They're different from other plants. It's always amuses me when I see people at a rose garden. It's they automatically want to stick their nose into the flower. So some roses do have nice fragrance, and many people are disappointed with a rose that doesn't have any fragrance. And modern roses will bloom from May till a killing freeze in October or maybe even November. So they give you a lot of blooms over a really long time. And there are even some roses that have been developed that don't have thorns, but most roses do have thorns. And 25 years ago, it's hard to believe it's been that long since Knockout was released. It won the All-America Rose Selection as the best rose in 1999, and it really changed what people expect from roses. I saw it a few years later in the New York Botanical Garden in 2003, and there was a big bed of it planted, and Knockout was very successful because it had much lower maintenance requirements. You get a nice display without all the trouble that people have to go to be successful with growing the long stem florist type roses, the hybrid teas. It's more winter hardy than a lot of hybrid teas. It doesn't have to be deadheaded to remove the hips to keep it flowering. It's mostly sterile, although it can set seeds if you cross-pollinate it with another variety. But even if you don't prune the old spent flowers, it still keeps flowering. And it's quite resistant to black spot and powdery mildew. So those things all made Knockout a big success, and it changed the expectation of new varieties. So the shrub rose, those varieties started supplanting or replacing the hybrid teas, but there's still people who like an old variety like Mr. Lincoln that was released in 1964, or Queen Elizabeth in the 50s. Some of those roses are in peace from the end of World War II. So there's some famous roses that are hybrid teas that people still grow. This is a picture of the Arboretum when the rose garden was at its peak. And there were a lot of different kinds of roses to have that many varieties. As I mentioned, we would one year I lost about a quarter of the varieties. Some of you may remember 2007, the Easter freeze. It was pretty devastating for Japanese maples and roses and a lot of other plants that had already broken dormancy, and then we had a real hard freeze in early to mid-April, and it really devastated. I lost about 500 plants that year, and it took a couple years to recover. The title of the talk, getting more out of your roses. You get more from roses if you give them the things they need. Roses really like sun, so full sun is better than mostly shady areas. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Most roses don't grow in the desert. They actually require quite a lot of water, but they can't stand in water. They have to have good drainage, good aeration in the soil. but pretty constant moisture, regular watering really helps. There's some roses, shrub roses or species rose, Rosa rugosa. Those roses, you really don't need to spray for diseases. They're very winter hardy, but they're not drought tolerant. And a month with no water or no rain, they will die in one summer if you don't give them water at least weekly. Roses feed pretty heavily on nutrients. They like good fertility, good organic matter in the soil, but they need regular fertilization to keep up the growth. And really, if you can use liquid fertilizers, you're irrigating, you're giving them water and fertilizer at the same time. And the attention, giving your roses attention, the more time you spend with the roses, you'll see problems that are developing, maybe black spot or disease coming in, or you can see some insect pest. So controlling the pests is really a big part of attention, but maybe attention also for some roses like the hybrid teas, deadheading, removing the spent flowers so the bush doesn't produce seed. Instead, it grows the next flower. So really, it's just those things. Roses need a large amount of sunlight and regular watering, good soil fertility. So maybe a minimum of 3 times a year of fertilizing, although some people will fertilize every other week throughout the whole growing season up until about Labor Day, and then you can stop fertilizing. And what type of fertilizer you use is important as well. So you always need to know from a soil test what your garden soil is providing. In 2011 through 2013, the Arboretum at UK was a location for the test program for new roses through the American Rose Society. And it was the first time that they had that program for new roses that was no spray. You weren't supposed to spray for disease control to see how hardy and resistant the varieties were. And I think the Arboretum, they have some new test roses, but it's not as large of a formalized program as it had been. One of the test roses back then was a dwarf version. It was almost like a miniature rose size, but it was a knockout, just a mutant knockout that was miniature. I mentioned knockout being 25 years old. Or roses that are even older than that, like this Floribunda from 1956 called Chuckles. It was a really good variety, very winter hardy, quite resistant to black spot. The shape of the bush wasn't as good as or symmetrical. It would need a little bit more pruning than knockout, but it definitely is very colorful and makes a big impact. Most people expect roses to bloom all season long, all summer long, but there are a lot of old varieties of old garden roses, many different types of roses that just bloom one time. And a lot of them will bloom a little bit later than the hybrid teas for their first bloom. So if your roses are blooming in the middle of May, some of these, like the Rambler roses and this Albertine, they'll bloom in June for 2 or 3 weeks and really put on a great display. And then they don't flower anymore until the next year. So a lot of people, I mean, some people want constant flowering, but these generally don't need as much care as far as disease control. They still would benefit from being watered and having good fertility, but they definitely are lower maintenance in some ways than the hybrid teas. When I used to participate in the Rose Society meetings, some of the people who grew roses would be quite preachy and tell you exactly what you need to do, and you better do what they say. I always think there are suggestions, not requirements. You don't even have to plant a rose bush if you don't want to grow a rose. It's not mandatory. So these steps of growing roses are suggested tasks and not requirements. Sometimes there are certain periods of time that things need to be done in a timely manner, like the spring pruning. It's important that it be done before a lot of new growth happens, because you don't want to remove the new growth when you're pruning. You want to prune before all that new growth is there. And that's generally from around the time that forsythias or daffodils are blooming for the spring bloom. And I've mentioned that different roses require different inputs. Some shrub roses and old garden roses are more resistant than to many diseases. And if you grow a really winter hardy rose, you don't have to go to as much effort to winterize them, to mulch them, to protect them from the cold. So different rose varieties, different rose types require different inputs. And not everybody expects all of their roses to be able to win a blue ribbon at the fair, or to be as good as any of the florist roses that you can buy. So if you have lower expectations, you don't demand perfection, then you don't have to put in as much effort for those. And a lot of those lower maintenance roses can be really beautiful, especially in the landscape. Knockout, as nice as it is, it's not a long stem florist type rose. It's not as double as the hybrid teas, but it's still beautiful. Some of these, where you get your plants, and in the past, bare root through catalogs was much more common. The rose industry is not as big as it used to be 20 or 30 years ago, but the bushes are graded, the plants are graded. Number ones are the top grade. Things that don't have as many canes, or the canes aren't as large, are 1.5, and they're the runts. And it's best to buy them in person. You have the choice. If a nursery has 10 plants of Mr. Lincoln, you can pick out which one you think looks the best from all of them if you're there in person. But if you order something from mail order, they're just going to grab whichever plant is next on the pile and put it in your box that's coming to you. So for a while, I would buy the cheaper roses that the big box stores sell in the spring. They're usually packed in sawdust and little tight plastic tubes. I found that half of them aren't the variety that they claim to be. A lot of them have rose mosaic virus infections, and those aren't as popular or aren't as common as they used to be. But you can find high quality local or mail order plants from nurseries that specialize in roses. There's several. I've gotten roses from Edmonds Roses for a long time. And some of the sources that nurseries, local nurseries, when they buy their rose bushes wholesale, where they get them from, also have a lot of times they'll have a retail division of, and there's several good sources of information on where to buy roses if you're looking for a particular variety, or you have certain requirements of what you're looking for. In my grass breeding efforts, I often get to go out to the Willamette Valley in Oregon, where the grass seed is produced, and the biggest airport near there is Portland. And a few times when I've flown out during the summer to see my grasses, I could stop by the Portland Rose Garden. It's an international test garden. And they have about 10,000 varieties of roses, but only 650 varieties. So they have multiples of any particular variety. And I checked, their hardy zone is 8B, so they don't suffer the winter kill that we have here in Kentucky. And it's not as hot. They're farther north, so it's a more temperate climate. And sometimes it rains a lot, but when the roses are blooming, it's bright and sunny, and it really is spectacular. I think June, the month of June, is the best time to visit, and it really is spectacular. It's a nice place, and they have different beds with hybrid teas or floribundas. This is a hillside, a slope, fairly steep slope with floribundas planted on it, and you can see different varieties flower at different times, and they're fairly well. Everything is labeled, so you can take notes, and they do rotate. So if a variety isn't doing as well, they'll replace it with a new variety over time. But a lot of them have been there at least 20 years. In the past, most roses were grafted onto a rootstock, and that was much more common, partly because it's faster to ramp up. A new variety was developed. If you wanted to make 1,000 copies of it to sell, budding or grafting was much more efficient, faster. Recent times, the industry has learned how to root cuttings and grow a lot of roses on their own roots. And own root plants are inherently more winter hardy, and the rooting cuttings is easy to do. It's not as much skill involved as required for grafting. So, and some rose varieties do grow better on their own roots. Another reason grafting was used, some parts of the country where there are nematode problems, you can use a rootstock that's resistant to nematodes or some other soil condition. But own root roses are getting more and more common. Mentioned roses like light, they like sun. More sun is better than less. And really, anything less than 4 hours of direct sun, you're not going to have very much flowering. That's shady. 8 hours gives you twice as many flowers as 4 hours of sunlight, but full sun, 12 or 14 hours, whatever the day length is in the summertime here, you get more blooms with more sun, but in full sun, individual blooms don't last as many days. But the display will be better because they're just more flowers. And roses don't like to be crowded by other plants. Grass grows right up to the canes. The grass will compete and take up a lot of the water and nutrients, and the roses will suffer. So really, roses together in a bed in most cases, or as a specimen plant with space around it and at least a foot or foot and a half of mulch around the drip line, beyond the drip line, they'll do better. Some people have problems trying to grow roses in areas where there's not good air flow, like a dead air space, corner of fence on two sides. If there's not good airflow, sometimes you get problems with spider mites. If it's a moist area where it's slow to dry out, you may have more powdery mildew, other diseases. Those are potential problems. So good air circulation, not crowded by other plants, as much sun as possible. Roses like very fertile soil with good organic matter, but they demand drainage, well-drained soil. The first big rose garden that I planted at the Arboretum, I used an auger to dig the holes, and the ground was pretty compacted. And when I put the irrigation system in, some of those holes that I dug held water, and some of the roses drowned just because the drip irrigation, the soil wasn't aerated enough, and then the drainage was really bad. So I learned quickly that the whole bed needs to be suitable for the growth of the rose roots. So organic matter helps and adds water holding capacity and aeration. So any kind of compost or old manure, any organic matter will help. It's hard to do on a large scale. In some places you may need to add sand or some other coarse material to improve drainage, but really the easiest way to improve drainage is to have a raised bed. You should know what your soil is providing to the plants by having a soil test done, and that can tell you which nutrients, which fertilizers are needed, and whether or not you need to adjust the pH. And roses like a near neutral pH, so 6 to 7 is ideal. They can tolerate a little outside of that, but if it's too acidic, they won't grow as well. I think it needs to be above 8.5 before the alkalinity starts to be a problem. I learned the hard way too that when you get new roses that are bare root, and the same way with fruit trees or anything else that you get bare root, you need to rehydrate it. You need to soak them in water overnight so the plants aren't half dried up when they go into the ground. So if you can do that, when I did that, when I soaked all the bare root roses, I never lost any roses, but sometimes when I would get a shipment in and I was in a hurry or whatever, and I went ahead and planted them without soaking them, I averaged losing 1 out of 4. So it doesn't take too long to learn the lesson. So soaking is good. A larger hole is better than a small hole. And some people, depending on your inherent soil, some people will add sand and organic matter in equal parts to fill in the hole. But again, if you can amend and improve the whole bed that the roses are growing in, it's better than just doing it in the hole that you're going to put the plant. If you're planting grafted roses, the bud union should be, it depends. Here in central Kentucky, it needs to be close to the soil line. Farther south, it can be a little above the soil line. If it gets too far below the soil line, the bud union will actually produce roots, and the rose will become an on root rose. And that's not really a problem, but you need to water the soil when the hole's half full when you're planting it to make sure there are no air pockets. And then when you finish covering, mulch to cover the crown. And so you almost mulch like you're going into the winter. And that helps keep the dormant canes from drying out as the roots develop. And this would be ideally done early in the spring, and probably March, you would get your dormant bare root roses. Not many people do that anymore. Most people buy them in nursery pots, 3-gallon pot or 2-gallon pot, whatever the size is. And that you don't have to worry as much about rehydrating and letting the root system develop. The roses are already growing. Several years I've got to go over to the UK and England. David Austin has a nursery where his greenhouses are that he makes the crosses to develop the Austin roses. And this was in August, and it was the second cycle of blooming for these roses. So they have a cooler climate and fewer cycles of bloom. You can see the guy there in the red rain jacket. It was in the low 50s for the high that day, so quite a bit cooler than here in Kentucky. And the amazing thing is the David Austin roses in England are about half the size they get here in Kentucky. We just have higher temperatures and a longer growing season, so the the plants get much larger. Roses need to be pruned for the shape, and different types of roses need to be pruned in different ways. So old garden roses that just bloom one time, you don't want to prune them until after they flowered. The main purpose of pruning roses is to remove any winter damaged material, growth that's crossing or crowding in the center. And one of the rules of thumb is when you cut a stem of roses, the pith should be white. The center of the stem should be white. If it's brown or black, that means it was frozen and winter damaged and won't be healthy. So you need to keep pruning lower until the pith of the canes is healthy. And you prune roses for shape as well, and different varieties respond better to being either pruned harder or not as hard. So floribundas and shrub roses like knockout, you can almost prune them with a hedge trimmer and shape them like you would boxwood if you want to, but hybrid teas definitely need stronger, healthier canes that are growing outward and aren't crossed. And rule of thumb for hybrid teas of 3 to 6 canes left after pruning. It all depends on the variety and how severe the winter is, of how short they will be. You want to encourage the growth to be toward the outside, not into the middle and crowding each other. Prune at a slight angle above the buds. If you get the angle correct, the new growth will be almost continuous from the old cane. There, roses that have a lot of weak growth will end up producing blind growth or twiggy canes that don't have flowers on the end of them. So if you ever have a branch that doesn't have a bloom on the end of it, it's because it's too weak or crowded and just didn't have enough energy to make a flower. And it's best to remove that blind growth. And I always struggled with this last thing. Harder pruning is better than under pruning. It seems to me too harsh to prune a hybrid tea down to 6 inches. That's really short, but if the winter damage says, keep going lower, that works better. It's in the long run, after a month, when you prune a month later, the plant will be healthier if you prune it, especially for the hybrid teas that might have more winter damage. This is an image that I copied from some Rose Society publications that a lot of different ways that you can prune incorrectly. And again, the bottom image of, it depends on the type of rose. You don't have to remove as much from shrub roses as from a hybrid tea. And the correct cut, the angle, slight angle, and a quarter of an inch above the bud. I always like the bypass pruners. The anvil type pruners are more for woodier material like trees. The scissor type bypass pruners like Felcos, those are the ones that work the best. If it doesn't rain, it's best to water them 2 or 3 times a week. An inch of rain per week is ideal. So that would be 6 to 8 gallons of water per bush. If you're giving them the water that way, if there's a drought and there are water restrictions, you can use the gray water to irrigate. We've had some years like that. Good mulch helps conserve water. Trickle drip irrigation is better than overhead that wets the leaves. If you have more organic matter in the soil, that helps the soil hold the water. If you water overhead, it's better to do it earlier in the day so the leaves have a chance to dry before going into the night. Wet leaves if the leaves have water, a layer of water on them for 8 hours, that's what a lot of fungal spores require, 8 hours of leaf wetness to germinate and attack the plant. So usually a dew doesn't last that long if it's raining, but certainly if you're irrigating late at night, you may end up with more disease. Roses do use a lot of fertilizer, a lot of nutrients. The balanced fertilizer like 10-10-10 or 20-20-20, 20-10-20, some of those are good, but sometimes they need more. There's some magnesium deficiency symptoms that cause chlorosis, and a tablespoon of Epsom salts per gallon of water added to the roses about once a month during the summer will make the roses look a lot better. They'll be bigger and healthier, and the leaves will be darker green. Epsom salts is magnesium sulfate, and both magnesium and sulfur are essential plant nutrients. And the 10-10-10, you're getting nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Some of the fertilizers are complete. They have the micronutrients as well, and the secondary nutrients, the calcium, magnesium, sulfur, are the second set of 3 nutrients after N, P, and K. I always use the time release fertilizer as well as liquid fertilizers. So Osmocote, it's pretty expensive, but it did seem to help the plants look better. Any kind of manure, compost, organic sources of fertilizer are good as well. That will be slower release, and they cost more, but they're adding organic matter, and they're better for the soil health. Anything that you can deliver in water is good, because again, roses don't like to be drought stressed. And always go by the directions and get the rate right. You can burn roses if the nutrient concentration is too high. If it says a tablespoon per gallon, don't use 2 tablespoons per gallon, because that may burn the leaves. Black spot and powdery mildew are the main diseases that roses have year in and year out. There are several others that you can see, but black spot is particularly bad because it makes the leaves fall off of the roses. And if roses just have stems, they're not going to be very healthy or make many flowers. And fungicides are a little different from insecticides. The fungicides can be used preventatively before the disease is really becoming a problem, but you shouldn't spray an insecticide unless you know the insect is present. The fungal spores are around, and they'll blow in from the wind or splash from the soil when it rains. And with any pesticide, it's always important to read the label and be safe and use the least toxic option that you have. And there are some organic methods of reducing the diseases, and some of it are cultural as well, just having good air circulation and not having the bush crowding itself with the way it was pruned. When I've gone to the UK and England, Kew Gardens, I saw this in, I think, 2006. And there were a lot of roses, but roses had a lot of black spot. And then the next time I visited that area where the rose beds were, they had taken them out. And you can sort of see behind the people a little bit, they were transitioning the rose garden to lavender. And lavender and roses have different requirements for culture, and I was amazed that the roses were gone and everything was planted in beds of lavender. There are lots of fungicides that are effective and can be used on roses for black spot and powdery mildew control. And this is just a list of several of the things that I've used in the past. Black spot is named because that's what the disease looks like. Again, it causes defoliation of the leaflets and sometimes the whole leaves, and it really parasitizes, weakens the plant. And at the Arboretum, we sprayed every week to control diseases, but sometimes it would rain right after we sprayed and wash it off. But this plant with a lot of leaves is called Smooth Lady, and it's one of the thornless varieties. There was a breeder who developed a lot of thornless varieties. It holds its leaves. It's more resistant to black spot than some of the other varieties of hybrid teas. And you can see just looking at the different plants, each plant is a different variety, that some of them have a lot more leaves than others, and that's just the inherent resistance, and it's black spot. Powdery mildew tends to be a bigger problem earlier in the season, and if it rains for several days in a row, it's more of a problem in April and May and September, late September, than it is in midsummer. But black spot is a problem the whole season long. A lot of insects will feed on roses. Aphids can be a problem. You can dislodge them with a stream of water, or let the ladybugs help you out. Fairly new pest that about the only thing that can really make knockout roses look ugly are rose slugs. And rose slugs are the larval stage of a sawfly, and they scrape the leaf and make the leaves look like Swiss cheese. They put holes, and they're little sort of small inchworm looking things, and they feed on a lot of roses. But thrips are usually a problem just one time in late spring, and they show up. Their damage is more on white and yellow or lighter pink roses. And Japanese beetles can be a problem, a very severe problem, but usually just for a few weeks in midsummer. So the rose slug, you can see the holes in the leaves, and a lot of times it's not all the way through the leaf. They scrape and feed on the cells in between the upper and lower epidermis, or they don't always go completely through the leaf, but they take all the green part out. And again, it's the larval stage of a sawfly. Japanese beetles really like roses. The only thing I know that they like better than roses are grapes. That's what the picture on the left shows. They'll eat the petals, the buds, leaves, new growth. You can use 7 to kill Japanese beetles, but unfortunately it kills a lot of beneficial insects as well. If you can hand gather them early in the morning before it's very warm. They don't fly away very fast. You can knock them into a bucket of soapy water and take care of them that way. But they really can decimate roses at certain times of the year. Lots of insecticides are available. Some of these might not be as easy to find, or they're not available at the big box stores, but some of them are. And again, water can be quite effective for dislodging aphids. If you do that 2 or 3 days in a row and then wait for the ladybugs to come in, you won't have to spray any pesticide at all. We would lose 1 to 200 rose bushes every year at the Arboretum 20 years ago to rosette disease. It's a virus. The vector of the virus is leaf curl mites, and early on they weren't sure. Scientists weren't sure what the problem was, if it was a virus or something else, but now it's known it is a virus. It causes a witch's broom, sort of uncontrolled growth. Blooms don't get the same color. The plants suffer more winter damage. And really the best control is eradicating an infected plant. And what it looks like I think these are knockout, some on campus, but just a big cluster of red growth. It's really devastating. Sometimes you'll see it in multiflora rows in the countryside. Um, Again, it looks unhealthy. The plants, the canes will die back, and there's no recovery from it. It is a fatal, and it affects knockout the same as any of the other varieties. There are a couple of varieties that have been developed that seem to be resistant to the leaf curl mite, so they don't get it infected as quickly. So there are some new varieties that are a little bit resistant, and some rose gardens have had to stop growing roses because the rose rosette problem wipes out a new rose bush in 2 or 3 years. So it's pretty devastating. The bottom right picture looks a little bit like rose rosette, but it's actually Roundup or glyphosate damage. If you're trying to kill the weeds close to your roses and you get a couple drops of Roundup on the rose, it won't kill them immediately. It'll take several months. And the first symptom are these leaves that are real narrow and not as dark green. And it does look superficially similar to the witch's broom of rose rosette. Again, this is a problem that's been going on for a couple decades now. If you really are on top of your roses and see an early infection, sometimes you can prune out a branch before it's got systemic, but when the basal canes are infected, the whole plant is infected systemically. And the 50 to 100, a couple years we lost more than 200 roses per year. And I never could find the source where the virus was coming from into the arboretum. Roses can look really beautiful in September and October before frost because the days are a little cooler and there's not as much heat and drought stress. But to get the roses ready for the winter, you need to stop fertilizing around Labor Day. You can slow down or stop deadheading to let the roses harden off, but it's still important to keep watering and keep the leaves as healthy as possible until frost. And once roses have gone dormant after a few hard freezes, you can prune them, shorten them so they're not as prone to being damaged by ice in the winter or wind. So you can shorten them a little bit. And then it's good to mulch, the mound mulch around the crowns if there are hybrid teas that might have winter damage. There are a couple organic sprays like lime sulfur and dormant oil that can spray dormant roses during the winter before they start growing. That can kill spores, the fungi that cause disease, or kill the eggs of some insects. That's good to use. There's a product called wilt proof, and there are other anti-desiccants that you can spray on the roses. And we don't have as much problem here in Kentucky with freeze drying, but if the rose bush is frozen solid for 4 or 5 days in a row, and there's a lot of wind and the sun shines on it, sometimes they dry out and they freeze dry. Wilt proof and similar products seal the canes and prevent that desiccation. Some of those things are used on Christmas trees to make them keep their needles longer. Hybrid teas are the most demanding. Other roses that are less demanding, things like Carefree Beauty, which is one of the parents or a grandparent of knockout. Dr. Buck was a rose breeder at Iowa State, and he had a lot of roses, and some of those are still available that are more winter hardy and quite disease resistant. And some of them look as nice. They look very similar to a hybrid tea. Shrub roses like knockout. In 1984, Bonica was a shrub that won. I think it was the first shrub that had won the AARS. New Dawn is a really nice climbing light pink rose. It's famous for being the first plant that was patented in 1930. And it actually was a sport of Dr. W. Van Fleet. Dr. W. Van Fleet just bloomed once, but someone had one of those plants that a branch kept blooming, kept blooming, kept blooming, and they were smart enough to take a cutting of it, and it got named New Dawn. And so it's been around almost 100 years now. Rugosa roses are fragrant. They're not very double, but they're good in the landscape, good shrub roses, very, very winter hardy and immune to black spot, and usually don't have any problems with any other diseases. The only problem they have is they don't like to be dry. I mean, they need as much water as other roses. Iceberg, Floribunda, and Chuckles, both of those have been around a while and are more winter hardy and disease resistant than others. The David Austin roses, they do have good winter hardiness, even though in England where they are developed, it's not as cold as here. Some companies are specializing in low input, sort of sustainable roses, the earth-friendly roses. They're different breeding companies that are specializing in roses that require fewer pesticides,